Night had fallen over Guadalcanal on September 12, 1942, when Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson stood silently on a jungle ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field, listening to sounds he would never forget. In the choking blackness below, hidden within the snarled vegetation, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers were crawling into their assault positions. Edson could hear them clearly: the snap of twigs, the faint metallic clink of rifles, muted commands barked in Japanese that did not even attempt to conceal themselves. They were that confident. Edson commanded 840 Marines, a mix of raiders and parachutists, exhausted, hungry, sick, and worn down by weeks of constant combat. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. And yet the ridge beneath Edson's boots was the last defensible high ground before the airfield. If the Japanese seized it, they would pound the runway with artillery until Henderson Field became useless. The aircraft that kept the island supplied would be destroyed. The 12,000 Marines on Guadalcanal would be cut off, surrounded, and crushed. Everything came down to this strip of coral and kunai grass. Edson turned to his men. They were filthy, hollow-eyed, and trembling from fever. Many had not slept in more than a day. Their uniforms were shredded by jungle rot. Some had lost 20 pounds since landing. Yet every man still gripped his rifle, though their hands shook with malaria and exhaustion. Edson did not speak of glory, honor, or patriotism. He simply told them the truth: hold for one more night, and they would be relieved at dawn. Just one more night. Then the darkness came alive with movement as the Japanese advanced. What followed over the next 12 hours would become one of the turning points of the Pacific War. It shattered Japanese assumptions about American weakness. It cemented the Marine Corps' reputation as a ferocious ground force the Empire of Japan would never again underestimate. But to understand why this one night mattered, the larger world must be understood. In the summer of 1942, Japan was winning, dominating, even. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific at a speed that embarrassed Western militaries. Hong Kong fell in 17 days. Singapore collapsed into the largest British surrender in history. The Dutch East Indies, Burma, Wake Island, and the Philippines had all been overrun. Japan now controlled a vast territory stretching over 5,000 miles. Their military intelligence confidently reported that Western soldiers lacked the spirit to fight. Japanese officers believed deeply in the superiority of the Bushido tradition, convinced that spiritual strength gave their infantry an edge Western nations could not match. Their conclusion seemed obvious to them: one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. They also believed the Marines on Guadalcanal numbered barely 2,000, badly supplied and demoralized. Imperial headquarters planned their recapture based on these fantasies. But Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, knew the real situation. His men had landed on August 7th with only 17 days of supplies. The Navy, hammered by the Battle of Savo Island, had withdrawn. Japanese aircraft bombed Henderson Field daily. Navy cruisers shelled the perimeter at night. The Tokyo Express raced down from Rabaul bringing fresh troops. The Marines were sick, starving, and isolated. Yet Vandegrift knew something the Japanese did not. He knew what Marines were trained to do. Marine Corps boot camp lasted longer than any other American service. Every Marine learned to master the rifle before anything else. Their doctrine, "Every Marine a rifleman," was not a slogan but a carefully engineered culture. Since the 1930s, the Marines had pioneered amphibious warfare, running massive landing exercises that taught them how to coordinate infantry, naval gunfire, and aviation in ways no other military had attempted. They had invented assault tactics that would define the Pacific War. Japan was about to meet the product of that training. The first lesson came on August 21st at the Ilu River, misnamed the Tenaru. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki arrived with 917 elite Japanese infantry, veterans of China and Guam who believed their shock tactics would sweep the Marines aside. They attacked at night, screaming as they charged across a sandbar, straight into Marine machine guns that had been carefully placed, sighted, and registered. The Japanese charge disintegrated almost instantly. Marines fired with the calm precision drilled into them at Paris Island. Bodies piled so thickly on the sandbar that later attackers had to climb over the dead. By dawn, more than 800 Japanese lay dead. Ichiki burned his colors and committed suicide. U.S. Marine losses were 35. Tokyo dismissed the defeat as Ichiki's recklessness. They assumed a larger force would succeed. They never imagined the Marines themselves were the reason. Major General Kayotake Kawaguchi led 3,000 men through the jungle to attack from the south, where Edson and his raiders now waited. Kawaguchi's march took weeks through swamp, vine, and choking brush. His troops were exhausted and disease-ridden even before they reached the assault line. Edson's Marines dug shallow fighting holes into the hard coral, cleared fields of fire, coordinated with artillery, and prepared to die where they stood. At 9:30 p.m., September 12th, Japanese cruisers and destroyers opened fire, pounding the ridge with high-explosive shells. Coral shrapnel flew like knives. Then, through the grass, the Japanese advanced. The fight instantly devolved into a nightmare of muzzle flashes, screams, steel, and splintered darkness. Wave after wave hurled themselves at the Marine line. Officers charged with swords raised. Machine gun crews fired until their guns glowed red. Marines fought with bayonets, knives, broken rifle stocks, and their bare hands when ammunition ran low. The center line collapsed. Paratroopers were overrun. Japanese soldiers reached within yards of Henderson Field. Van de Grift, at his command post, later admitted it was the only time during the entire campaign he feared the Marines might break. At the collapsing center, Edson appeared again and again, rallying men who were seconds from panic. Standing on an ammunition box, silhouetted against exploding shells, he yelled orders with total calm. When Marines shouted they could not hold, he told them, "By God, you will hold. Now get back there and do it." They did. At 3 a.m., the crisis reached its peak. Edson had committed every reserve. If the Japanese broke through again, the airfield would fall. Then the 11th Marines opened fire. Their artillery had carefully registered points along the ridge. Now, in the darkness, their shells poured down with mechanical precision. The Japanese advance evaporated under the bombardment. At dawn, the ground was carpeted with bodies. 600 to 800 Japanese dead, fewer than 60 Marines killed. Kawaguchi retreated into the jungle with remnants of his brigade, most of whom would die of starvation. The myth of Japanese invincibility was cracking. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui wrote in his private diary that their faith in the superiority of charging power had been shattered. He admitted American firepower and discipline were vastly more effective than Japanese intelligence had predicted. He also noted, in disbelief, that instead of the 2,000 Marines Tokyo believed they were fighting, the Americans actually had 12,000 on the island. Still, Japan refused to learn quickly. They launched attack after attack, culminating in the massive battle for Henderson Field in late October. 20,000 Japanese troops stormed the Marines' lines. Battleships shelled Henderson Field with 14-inch guns. Yet the Marines held. The Japanese suffered 3,500 dead in 3 days. American losses were under 300. By February 1943, Japan abandoned Guadalcanal entirely. They had landed 36,000 troops. Between 20,000 and 30,000 died. U.S. forces lost 1,600. The myth of Japanese superiority died on Guadalcanal. In the months that followed, Japan learned that Marines fought with a structure unlike any army in the world. The Marine Fire Team, 3 4-man cells per squad, allowed squads to deliver triple the automatic fire of an army unit. This was decisive in close jungle combat. Japan also learned that Marines used maneuver tactics designed for chaotic beach assaults and fragmented units, giving them flexibility and independence under pressure that Banzai tactics could never overcome. But Japan also adapted. At Tarawa, Rear Admiral Shibasaki boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take his island in 100 years. Marines took it in 76 hours. Nearly 1,000 Marines died, wading chest-deep through water under point-blank fire due to a miscalculated tide. Yet when the battle ended, only 17 Japanese defenders remained alive. Tarawa proved fortified positions could fall, but at a terrible price. Next came Peleliu. Japanese Colonel Kunio Nakagawa abandoned Banzai charges entirely. Instead, he created the most complex underground defensive network yet seen: caves, tunnels, concrete bunkers. Marines who expected another short, violent Tarawa instead walked into a 73-day nightmare. Peleliu nearly annihilated entire Marine regiments. Some companies lost 60% in a week. Nakagawa's message before he died summed up the new Japanese doctrine: "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears." But the most profound transformation occurred on Iwo Jima under Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi. Kurabayashi knew America intimately. He had traveled across the U.S. and understood its industrial power and the discipline of its Marines. He also studied Tarawa and concluded that any commander who still believed Marines were weak was deluding himself. He banned Banzai charges entirely. Every soldier who died in a pointless frontal assault was a waste. Instead, he designed Iwo Jima as a fortress meant to bleed the Marines white. No defenses on the beach. No massed charges. Every cave would be a strong point. Every ridge a kill zone. His men would fight from underground tunnels, emerging only to kill and disappear. He intended to inflict 10 casualties for every Japanese soldier lost. He nearly succeeded. When Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they found no enemy waiting on the sand. Kurabayashi let them come ashore freely, then opened fire with every weapon he had. The battle became one of the bloodiest in American history. Nearly 7,000 Marines died. Kurabayashi's 21,000 defenders were wiped out almost to the man. He never saw Japan again. By Okinawa, the final act of the Pacific Theater, both sides had fully evolved. Marines were masters of combined arms assault, able to coordinate tanks, flamethrowers, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support with unmatched precision. Japanese defenders had perfected the art of forcing the Americans to fight for every hill and every cave. Over 12,500 Americans died. 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts were killed. The last whisper of the myth that Americans were spiritually weak was finally buried under the rubble of Shuri Castle. Yet the seed of that change, the moment Japan realized their assumptions were catastrophically wrong, was born on a narrow ridge on Guadalcanal. There, sick, starving, exhausted Marines stood against overwhelming numbers and simply refused to break. Their discipline, marksmanship, training, and ferocity changed the course of the Pacific War. That night, amid screams, gunfire, and shadows lit by artillery, the Marines showed the Empire of Japan a truth it would spend the next 3 years confronting. American infantry would not collapse. They would not run. They would endure the unendurable. And when the moment came, they would attack with a fury the Japanese had never anticipated. It began at the Tenaru. It exploded on Edson's Ridge. It spread across the Pacific, island by island, until Japan's war machine collapsed under the combined weight of American firepower, doctrine, and sheer refusal to surrender the initiative. In the end, Japan learned, too late, that spirit alone could not overcome Marine training, organization, and relentless adaptability. And the Marines, in turn, earned a legacy forged in sweat, blood, and iron on a remote island the world had barely heard of. Guadalcanal was the crucible. Edson's Ridge was the spark. And history was forever changed by a handful of exhausted men who held their ground on one desperate night and refused to let the line break.